Hi, I'm Jessica.
I'm Lark.
And I'm Hillary. And welcome to Hearsay, where we deep dive into the cultural moments that live rent-free in our heads, and probably yours too. And today we're making it clear that when dads take care of kids, it's not babysitting.
Amen and amen.
Not one.
It's just being a parent.
Yep. Novel concept.
So actually today, more broadly, we're talking about childcare. And we at the Law Center work on childcare as an issue all the time, but we have this problem where people don't always care about it.
Famously.
Yeah. And we wanted to kind of figure out why. And of course, we look at things through a pop culture lens anyway. So we started by naming every childcare movie and TV show we could think of.
Which was not
Exhausted.
a lot.
I think there was a lot.
I think there was a lot once we actually got
going.
down
but
to
it was hard to
Yeah.
start. And we found some tropes.
Yeah.
We found
Just a few.
We basically created two categories, and there's some subcategories underneath. The first is what I call super nanny, which is just like a nanny.
Right.
You know, the nanny depictions do exist in pop culture. So you've got the nanny.
Which, shout out to Fran Fine's
Yeah.
wardrobe. That's
Literally.
all-
Yeah. Solidarity to Fran, our union
Yes.
queen. So super nanny, like the actual reality,
God.
you know.
You guys are in a crisis. I'm on my way.
Joe something.
Frost.
Yeah. Mary Poppins. And then there's kind of like some subcategories under there. We noticed a lot of Black women, like the kind Black women. I know
Yes, savior.
that, right, who's like just a saint there, but not a real character otherwise.
Yeah. I feel like that's a common.
I've still never seen The Help,
one-liners.
but I know that it
I also
was.
Also
haven't seen
don't.
it. I just saw American Fiction a few months ago too. Did either of y'all see that?
Yes, so
Not yet.
good.
And their housekeeper who ended up being basically a part of their family throughout the movie and throughout their lives is also a Black woman, but it's a Black family too.
Yeah.
So I think that adds interesting layers to it. And even they find home and acceptance in her almost more than either of their parents, even though one of them had already passed away and kind of is the glue of their family. I feel like that is almost a super nanny in a way, even though all the kids are
a
adults.
trope of nanny in
Right.
media also is that the nanny is you're closer with the nanny than the parents. That the
Right.
parents who get nannies are workaholics and don't care about their kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That having
hire this-
childcare at all means, in some form, means that you
don't care about your kids.
Right. That's a whole other
Boo.
trope.
Yes. Yes. Well, and then speaking of tropes, the one that we found the most to a degree that I could not believe. It was like
Can y'all guess what it is?
it's like unfurling before us. We'd be like, oh, there was that, and there was that, and there was that. And here's what we're talking about. There's a dad, and suddenly he's confronted with the fact that there are children in the world that who need help, and he has to help them.
And they're his own kids.
There could
That
be his
he
own
probably
kids.
had
He's
for
for
years.
the
Right.
first time in his life,
Right.
realizing he has kids and maybe there's something
Yeah,
he could do to
and-
take care of them.
Yeah, and then, he has to discover that a vacuum exists and that children have diapers and they need to be fed and that children are messy and hard and blah, blah, blah,
I feel
blah,
like this
blah.
has a school drop-off
Yeah.
scene or a
Yes.
school sports.
Yes.
Mixed up the soccer cleats and the ballet
Yes,
shoes.
and the hapless dad.
Yeah.
The hapless dads. That's what we'll call this. And it can be men more broadly, I think. So we're going to just run through some of these and then we'll dig into them. This is, I'm surely not the oldest, but to me, as the Gen Xer that I am, the thing we certainly had on Betamax. That's right. Mr. Mom.
Do Betamax and TiVo.
Yeah, I know. All the technology through the years I have experienced, such as Gen X, we're so flexible. We adopt everything.
Exactly.
So Mr. Mom, and then Who's the Boss was on forever. And then Charles in Charge. And then we're going to go up to, Mr. Nanny, which is a movie with Hulk Hogan. Full House, 3 Men and a Baby, Daddy Daycare, Mrs. Doubtfire, which we're going to get into, The Pacifier. The point is, it wasn't hard to come up with a list. It felt to me at first that these, and especially Mr. Mom and Mrs. Doubtfire, which are about 10 years apart, were these what if we made a thing about dads and kids?
Right.
No one's ever seen that before. And the dad isn't going to be good, but then he is going to get good at this and he's going to appreciate
Reconnects with this
women's work.
family. Yeah.
And what drives me bananas about this is that the entire idea that the only depiction we're interested in when it comes to taking care of kids is if dads do it.
Yeah.
When in fact it is women's work and it has traditionally been. So we generally don't care about it unless men do
And
it.
it's only powerful if the man is doing what
when it
women
just
have
gets
been
thrown
doing
on women.
quietly and tirelessly.
Since the dawn of time.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, this pisses me off on a lot of levels. I can start with the like, long-time listeners, as if we've had a show that you could listen to a long time.
If you've been here for the beginning, you will know.
Original hearsay heads. Is that a thing?
It is now. Wait, that's cute. Hearsay heads. Hearsay bobbleheads.
But so, yes. Anyway, I have kids. That's all I was trying to say. I have kids and a husband. It's so traditional of me. But I got pregnant, and before I told anybody else, like we put ourselves on like wait lists for daycares in DC where we lived at the time. We never, for our first kid, we never got off the wait list. They never called. We just kept waiting. Like we were on like 15, and you have to pay money to be on these wait lists.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. The
to
deposits.
like hold your spot. Yeah. If you get one.
Yeah. So you're on these wait lists, and then it's just like not happening. And this is when like people start to panic and like form nanny shares or like, but my husband hated his job at the time and was like, I'm just going to stay home. And I was like, okay, let's just do it.
Yeah.
And he's been a stay-at-home parent since until this year where he started working at, drumroll, a preschool. So he is now a child care provider as
Daddy
well.
Daycare DC.
Go Dad. Yeah.
So my life is like built into this, like we're running in a different direction, right? Already. Like we're already not this. The number of times that he has been applauded by random strangers for pushing a stroller down the street. Like, nice job, Dad. So like, I'm not going to lie. I'm sensitive to this.
As you should
But
be.
rightfully, yeah.
There's good out of it though, for sure. My oldest, when he was about 3 or 4, came up to me one day and he's like, did you know that some mamas stay home and some daddas actually go to work? And I was like, yeah.
That's never occurred to him.
Yeah, but he didn't know because that's his little world. He saw
Right.
what he saw. And so even our youngest, like for so long, we asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? So he was like, a dad. So like, the modeling can happen, but not if you watch TV because you can't see it.
To have representation and exposure to it, I think there has to be a way to do it without being like, what?
Right.
Yeah.
But
Just
so
make it
much
normal.
of it is like
Exactly.
sensationalized.
Yeah.
Versus, and I'm trying to think, like in my mind, I'm trying to imagine like a profile piece, but even like profiling a dad taking care of his kids would warrant like,
Right.
moms
And that's what
aren't
it
being
always
profiled.
is.
Yeah. Versus
Yeah.
like having that representation. And countering that narrative, I think it would take so much undoing in so many different ways for it to be normal.
And I've seen like
Yeah.
on TikTok and Instagram a lot of dadfluencers posting like, I'm stay-at-home dad, here's, and reclaiming some of the stuff we talk about of you can take care of your kids, you're not a babysitter, kind of the weaponized incompetence trend that was going around of poor straight women talking about the shit their husbands don't do.
Yeah.
And I saw quite a few men creators take that over, which I do think that's a little bit more peer-to-peer rather than a feature in New York Magazine.
But on the flip side of that,
Tradwife.
TikTok, Tradwife. Exactly.
Yeah, where I can never stop talking about Tradwife TikTok. It's still being glorified of being this, quote, stay-at-home mom, homesteading, having a million kids. All those women have caregivers. They all have
And
someone's
do you see
watching their
those on
kids. No,
TikTok?
you don't
No.
see them. You think Ballerina Farm is watching all her children on that compound? No, she is not. Even Nara Smith. Those people have people that watch their kids.
Well, maybe let's dig into some of these.
I watched Daddy Daycare for the first
I
time.
know. How was
My
that?
first time ever watching it. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be in terms of like the sensationalization. Eddie Murphy can also do a voice.
Yeah.
I always forget, and every time he
And
whips out a
isn't
voice.
Regina King his wife?
Regina King is his wife, and I was
Incredible.
like, Regina, she was so good. And the whole premise is that like his wife is going back to work. They put their child in. They want to put him in daycare, and it's really expensive. And it was also funny, like when they go to pay for it, and they're like, "Oh, this is how much tuition is per year."
Yeah.
And she goes, "No, per month."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Okay."
And
so
isn't it like a
least they
stereotypical?
acknowledge it.
like,
yeah.
again, we're in the elite preschool.
Yeah, they have like uniforms.
trope,
It's like, almost boarding school-esque.
Lots of tropes of that. And the dad, Eddie Murphy, gets laid off along with another dad. And so they can't afford to pay for the daycare. And then they go around shopping for other daycares. And I thought that the representation of like home daycares was really interesting and dramatized. Like, it was so crazy, but also it was like,
Because
At
that's
least
what
it
they
was
ended
there.
up doing. Yeah, was making a home care center.
yeah, they ended up making a home daycare. But it was like, there was one where like the lady was holding a baby and like smoking.
Oh,
And there was
that's
one where like
God,
the kids are
no.
like in a basement.
Oh, my God.
And then eventually he convinces another dad to like start a home daycare center, make some money off of them having to watch their kids.
Right.
They're raising their children.
Correct.
Yeah.
And, you know, it expands, this, that, and the other. And I thought it was interesting to talk about, like, the lack of affordable options, and that's how they sold it to a lot of parents.
Yeah.
Like, we'll give you, like, a free trial, or, like, it's already significantly cheaper, while, like, you can also, like, trust us, maybe, and eventually, like, the parents do learn to trust them.
Yeah.
And then their former boss, like, found out that not only were they doing this, but they were watching his kid.
Yeah.
And he goes, well, like, you're wiping boogers for a living. And Eddie Murphy's like, well, you're paying us to do that. So
I mean, that's more representation. I'm not thrilled about the home care representation, but
better than I thought.
But at least they're acknowledging it's a profession.
Yeah. But either way, throughout the whole movie, they were talking about, like, until you get a real job, you're doing the daycare. They're like, I can't wait till I get back to real work, or like a real job. Like, caregiving is work.
Right.
They are working.
And it allows everyone else to work. Like,
yeah.
I think that's what makes me so mad about all of these tropes, is not only is it invisible, but when we do talk about it, it's made fun of, you know, minimized, or downplayed, minimized, and like joked about. And that's just so demeaning and condescending for no reason.
Because nothing happens without people watching kids.
Right. You can't do anything.
You can't get your coffee with the barista's childcare gives out. You can't.
Who's driving the bus to take you to work?
Exactly.
Someone who probably needs childcare.
I watched Mrs. Doubtfire last night for the first time.
I've also never seen the whole thing.
Wow.
I had a lot
it's
to
always
choose
on
from.
TV.
It is, and I just avoided it. It was a really depressing movie, actually.
Yeah.
It's
very
there's
sad.
like a lot of gender panic stuff that's not good. And like, obviously, like Robin Williams dressing up as a woman, they're not really like ready to interrogate that in a real way. So that aside, which is like a big thing to put aside, I think it just had this like, he's a good dad. And like, that's the plot of it. He's a really good dad.
Yeah.
So he, you know, makes himself into this like British super nanny. Mrs. Doubtfire, and then takes care of the kids, and antics do ensue. But the twist is he's like really good at it. He's like better than he was as a dad because he's like dedicating his whole self to it. And so the end result, after all of it, it gets discovered, and the judge is like, you went this far, like you're bananas, you shouldn't be, with them, and he loses custody entirely, except without visitation. It's like so depressing. Robin Williams can break your heart on camera. Like he's like, oh,
he's
so
good at
sad.
being heartbroken.
That's
crazy.
It's so sad. And then he ends up like taking the character onto like a public television kids show.
Oh yeah,
which is like a weird side twist. But they see him, and then Sally Field feels bad that she like took him from him and lets him. The big result, the big win, ready, is that he then gets to take care of the kids after school as himself, not as Mrs. Doubtfire. He's the dad, and so like that's his custody rights at the end, is he gets to babysit his kids. Going back to not parent his kids, he watches them for 3 hours after school and helps them do their homework. And and that's the big win.
I don't know if I don't think I've ever seen the end. I think I watched till court.
It was so upsetting. He should have never lost custody in the first place. And then second,
and also
that's
be a dad.
Just back to babysitting.
Right.
I like lost my mind.
I would. Wait, what year was that?
1993.
Like all the tropes in that feel specific to the time
for sure. And I think
it's like the businesswoman time.
Yeah,
like,
we're only interested in watching domesticity when it's a man.
Yeah,
like I guess it's the novelty of it or something, but it just drives me. Like I want more TV shows that are in like the throes of what it is to take care of children, to raise a family, to go to work, to like this. There need to be more shows like this. They're the ones I've always liked. You know,
the few that there are.
Yeah. But
I just think it shows we can't ever get better if we don't have our depictions be better. I mean, I don't even have children, but we sit here at work, do this work, are hearing from providers and from parents of how awful things are, but also how important care is. And women are shouldering this work in every sense of it. And it's just never going to set in if our media depictions don't do that.
So I'm child-free, childless, however you want to describe it, but I'm also 23, so like calm down. But even thinking about it, like if I don't move back to where my parents live, and in the future I have a kid with a partner whose parents also don't live in the same place, what are we going to do?
Yeah. I talk to my mom about that all the time.
Yeah.
I've been radicalized on the understanding that childcare should be a universal good that we all have, that the government pays for because they can and they should and they choose not to.
They literally choose
It's a choice they make every single day. So I've been talking to my parents about it because similarly I've been thinking, if I have kids with someone here, I'm childless by choice and I don't foresee myself having children. But if I do, I don't have family here. And we traditionally probably would work similar hours, me and my partner. So that would be really hard and they'd have to go into childcare. But I've been telling my parents, like, it doesn't have to be hard for any choice you make, right? If you choose to patchwork and keep your kids in your home, if you choose to go to a home daycare center, if you choose to go to a giant childcare center, if you choose to have a nanny share, you actually shouldn't have to worry about it at all. The government should pay for it. Yeah. And I feel like we've come to this, I don't want to call it a breaking point in the childcare.
I think the pandemic, and I know you're going to talk about this more later, Hillary, but yeah, I think the pandemic really like why are both parents at home and the mom is still taking care of the kids?
Yes. I know here at the center, we've been talking about just truly how bad it is, and there are ways to fix it.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack here, obviously, for everybody. But I think what I want to do, and we're going to have a conversation next, I'm going to talk to two amazing people I work with, Jasmine Tucker and Julie Vogtman, both geniuses at the Law Center.
Extraordinaires.
Yeah. Really smart people who have looked a lot into why is it this way? Mm-hmm. Why is childcare so expensive and so hard to find? Why are childcare providers paid so little?
Right.
And, we'll do a little history lesson, but then also how can we change it?
Yeah.
So that for maybe both of you, the choices aren't, it's a choice at all, really, to have kids. And we know younger generations are deciding not to.
Right.
For this very
reason.
There
are so many reasons not to.
This is one of them. Yeah.
This is one of them.
It's scary.
And how are you going to pressure someone into having a child, whether that's through reproductive restrictions or whether that's through just societal pressure, and then do nothing to provide for those children.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to unpack it all in the next conversation. But
and they're both mothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll be a mom's caucus in the next.
That's what we need.
Yeah. As you deserve, as we deserve.
Yeah. As all moms deserve, really.
Today, I'm joined by two truly lovely and smart humans who happen to work with me at the National Women's Law Center. Jasmine Tucker, our VP of Research, and Julie Vogtman, our Director of Job Quality. And I was going to describe their work for you all, but it's probably better if they do it.
I oversee the qualitative and quantitative work that we do. I think that a lot of our work is grounded in defining the problem that we need to solve.
Problems for women and families.
Right.
So Jasmine's the brain behind our numbers and our stories at the Law Center.
One of the many brains.
One of the many, yes, the lead brain. And Julie?
So I'm the Director of Job Quality at the Law Center. I focus on the policies that we need to put in place to improve the quality of jobs that, surprise, are not great, especially for women and especially for Black women, Latinas, Native women, other women of color.
And part of why I asked you both here is because you've done a ton of work and research on childcare, which is, of course, what we're talking about this episode. And not just childcare, but childcare providers. And so we're going to get into that, but I think it's the middle of the workday. We're recording this. Who's watching your kids right now? What is the childcare that led us to be here?
Yeah, so I have a kindergartner who's at kindergarten, but, school hours do not coincide with working parent schedules. So she goes to an aftercare program at school. And then I also have a 9-month-old. Yeah. And he is at an in-home daycare provider. Sometimes his grandma comes to watch him, but he's at his daycare providers today.
Awesome.
And I am very lucky to have 2 kids right now in elementary school, at the same elementary school, in the same aftercare program. So after many years in which that was not the case, I feel lucky to have a pretty steady, happy thing going on.
Nice. Yeah, so my 2 kids are also in elementary school, though we don't do aftercare because my husband is home and is their primary kind of parent when I'm not there. So there's all our care providers for whom this episode would not be possible without them.
Shout out.
Yes, exactly. So what we talked about in our earlier discussion with Jessica and Lark is that there are so many movies and TV shows where we don't even see childcare providers. If they're depicted, they're sort of sole nannies too. They're never at care centers or daycare facilities or childcare facilities. There's just no depictions of them at all. And so I think the whole point of this is we want to make visible what's invisible. So for both of you, could you tell me who is the typical invisible childcare provider that you've done so much research on? And then kind of the second question is, why does pop culture ignore them? Why don't we ever see them?
Ooh, there's some loaded questions in there. So when we're talking about childcare providers, we're talking about a workforce that's over 9 in 10 women. So this is women's work. And right, that's like inherently like the second question. We don't see them because we don't care about women's work. Yeah. It's like totally undervalued. But you just laid out, we're here because of our childcare providers, right? We're able to work because they're providing care for our children. And so in this workforce that's 94% women, it's also largely women of color, immigrant women, so Black women, Latinas, they're all overrepresented in this workforce. The backbone of our entire economy is being held up by Black and brown women who are providing care for our children.
Julie, why do you think we don't even see them?
I have so much to say on this topic. Yes. I'll try to keep it brief enough. But I mean, as Jasmine said, we know in this country, childcare is like the ultimate example of women's work. It's work that happens behind closed doors. It's work that for much of our history, women were not ever paid for at all, either because it was women caring for their own children or because it was enslaved Black women caring for white children. And so we have really devalued this work from our very beginnings as a nation. But like so many things in our history, I think really the devaluing of women's care work, and especially the devaluing of the care work performed by women of color, comes down to racism and sexism.
Say it.
Yeah. It's not surprising, but I think for folks who haven't ever spent time thinking about it, and certainly, for us, like in digging into childcare depictions in media and realizing like it's not there, a little light bulb goes off. Of course it's not there if we're trying to hide that this exists in the first place.
So in doing all of the research for this report a few years ago, I actually learned a ton and became even more depressed about sort of where we are today, because there actually was a moment about 50 years ago when we came so close to having universal childcare in this country. And I don't think everybody knows that. So we're going all the way back to 1971, even before the exennial cohort right here was before any of us were born.
Representation there. Yeah, I appreciate
it. But, that's a moment when women's labor force participation had really been skyrocketing for, decades. And Congress concluded that it was time to do something about it. I mean, after years, of course, of dedicated advocacy. But in 1971, Congress passed a law that basically would have established universal childcare in this country. And it would have shifted it from a private responsibility to a public good that was publicly funded. But President Nixon vetoed it. Any guesses why?
Because it's women's? Because women don't matter?
Because sexism and racism, again, but also communism in this case. So
it would have been a good.
Yes, exactly.
And a public good. And how dare we have anything that befits the whole country?
Precisely. So he said that the child care system that this law established, and here's the quote, would commit the vast moral authority to the side of communal approaches to child rearing over the family-centered approach. So it explicitly was like, wait a second, you would actually have this responsibility be shared among other people rather than inside the family, in private, with women where it belongs. And we cannot do that.
I really want to fight with him right now because there's no part of our society that exists in a vacuum. And it's like this idea that, individualism is like the problem that kind of hits us in all places. Right. It's the reason, it's problems with education, it's problem with healthcare, all these rights that are like people need to survive. Childcare is one of them. And yet we've decided that we're just going to make everyone go it alone in some sort of like display of American success, as if we all live alone in this country separately from each other.
the themes of this campaign to make sure that we never did get childcare, that it was like dead for good. It was a parents' rights campaign. And it's just so evocative of like 50 years later where we are with Moms for Liberty and like
that pushing, the fake outrage of what it means to decide what your kids know about the world.
Yeah.
But they called it parents' rights.
It was the 70s, so it was like this actual like paper flyer campaign from conservatives where Congress was like literally flooded with these flyers that were, the title was Raising Children, Government or Parents' Rights. And they made just absolutely bananas claims. It was like, if we have these childcare centers, children are going to unionize. Parents will not be allowed to take their children to church or tell them to take out the trash. Like, just
full
utterly wild.
Yeah. Well, and it's the same stuff with banning books right now.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
The same. And it totally worked. I mean, that like made sure that veto was the end, that it was like buried for years and years and years.
But they love to tell you that it takes a village to raise a child.
Which village?
Right. Which village,
Yeah.
right? Like, we were in the office one week, and I was going to be here longer than my childcare provider was open. So what do I do then? I have to go and piece together Family Friend Network, this so-called FFN network. You're getting care that's outside of sort of these more formalized paid processes or systems, and you're relying on your neighbor to pick up your kid from school because you can't make it there in time. You're calling a grandparent, right? And so you have to then build this village on your own, and it's so overwhelming and so insurmountable to piece together something that works for you. Didn't we almost have it all?
Yeah. Nixon. Okay. Well, so now we know who to blame. But
one of the many.
One of the many.
One of the many.
That was our history lesson. So I think the conversation around this has shifted over the last 4 years, like many things did because of the COVID pandemic. And I think all three of us were in the same boat, right? Suddenly we were home with our kids. We were all, remember our 2 weeks that stretched on of staying home. And we were told to work from home if you could. And I'll say, like, we were in a privileged position where we could work from home. We didn't lose our jobs. We had pay. Like all of that was still there. But we couldn't work and also take care of your children at the same time. And it's like the whole country woke up to that idea. And you both did this incredible research on women in work and what happened to women in COVID. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you learned and also what you think has shifted since then.
This is all data that we're looking at from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So if you look at the shift between February 2020 and April 2020, like there was a loss of over 22 million jobs, right? So people like us were able to sort of be cushioned. We could work from home, work with small children in the background, but lots of people, childcare providers, waitresses, restaurant cooks,
right? Things shut down,
right? Like jobs went away, right? And so they started coming back. But if you don't have care for your child, if your child has virtual school, how are you supposed to go in person anywhere to work? So we saw a lot of people leave the labor force altogether. Then we saw them start to trickle back. And then in September 2020, I think a lot of people, probably yourselves included, I didn't have a school-age kid at that point, were like, is school going to be open?
Right.
Is it going to happen? Spoiler alert, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so like 1 million people left the labor force that month. And so of those 1 million people, 8 in 10 of them are women. It meant that women could no longer be a worker, a teacher, right? Like all of the things that we're putting on them, they couldn't handle it anymore. So they all left the labor force. So since then, as schools opened back up, as other businesses have opened back up, as we've like recouped the jobs lost, we're still at a deficit, both men and women, in terms of the labor force participation rate, but we're heading back to our pre-pandemic level. But everything
have women gotten their jobs back, though, to that same degree, or is it?
Women lag behind men. We have not recouped our labor force participation. So the share of people who are in the labor force as a, right, like that's your numerator, and then the whole population is your denominator. We have not reached our pre-pandemic share, but men haven't either.
Got it. Cool. Listening to that, the underscore for me is like, cool.
Cool.
It's that kind of cool. Is right, like who was going to stay home first, who was going to lose their job.
Right. And it's part of it is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, right? If you're looking at a two-parent, we're making some assumptions here, two-parent heterosexual husband-wife household, who's making more? Who can afford, right? If you're going to go without one income, whose income is that going to be? It's going to be the one who's already underpaid and undervalued because you're more reliant on the other person's earnings.
2 years into the pandemic, Jasmine and I worked with a polling firm, GQR, to try to dig in more at the individual level to see what happened to women during those first 2 years, when that was already a point where the unemployment and labor force participation rates were looking better. But what we found was that in so many ways, women really had not recovered, and that caregiving had so much to do with it. And those interruptions in their careers meant that some of them hadn't gone back to work. Some of them had lost savings. Most people were at minimum feeling some sort of strain on their mental health.
We talked a lot about frontline workers through the pandemic, but the front line of like how our country works still rests on whether care is happening or not and whether women are able to do it or receive it so that they can work somewhere else. Like that's sort of the underline of what the pandemic showed us. Our country doesn't work without it, but then women can't work without care either.
Right. I do feel like it's important to note, too, that because that care crisis was so, clear during that pandemic period.
The people saw it for the first time.
Yes, the people saw it for the first time.
A lot of men saw it for the first time.
Yeah, they're stuck home with their kids.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. That was a moment where we did see big federal investment in childcare, unprecedented levels of federal investment in childcare. And that essentially kept our childcare system from totally collapsing. And that is something that a lot of our colleagues worked very hard to make happen. Right. And it was super important. But most of that so-called emergency funding actually expired last September. And the rest of it will run out later this year. But it was not funding that we actually can afford to lose because our childcare system was in crisis before the pandemic. And it's on the verge of being in crisis again without this funding.
Well, so let's talk about the system. You talked a little bit about how we had a way out with Nixon, but the way childcare works generally is you don't need it until you do. Childcare is hard to find. It's not available easily. And then it's really, really expensive. And the rates, depends where you live, obviously, but it is often sometimes more than your housing costs, right? And, if you take your salary and break it up, childcare ends up being sometimes the biggest expense. And then on the other hand of that, childcare providers are paid very little, a minimum wage or just barely more. And those wages then don't let them support their own families. They're important, valuable jobs, and yet they're barely compensated. And so this doesn't feel like a good system to me. We know there's a thing we all need. No one can afford it. No one can get it. And then the people doing this incredible work aren't given enough to let them do it as a job that lets them take care of their families. And so why is it like that now? And how can we fix it?
Let me touch on the scarcity piece for a second. In the pandemic, we lost about 1 million childcare workers, right? They didn't get relief in time in the early days. Some of them closed altogether and never reopened. The demand was down for a long time, right? People were too scared to send their kids back. And so 1 million jobs were lost in the pandemic. Okay. As of January 2024, which is almost 4 years after the pandemic started, we have just now recouped those 1 million jobs lost. So that means we have 4 years of population growth where we were going to have increased the number of childcare providers from that, February 2020 baseline to even keep up with the kids that were being born to care for them. And so in the 4 years in the interim, right, if we had a crisis in February 2020, imagine it's way worse now. It's way worse now.
So that's why no one can find it.
You can't find it.
I mean, really, it is just such a textbook example of a broken market because most people can't afford to pay a good salary or even a good chunk of a good salary just so that they can go to work themselves.
Right. You hear that all the time. You see someone say it's cheaper for me to stay home.
So we have this situation where a typical childcare worker is making $13, $14 an hour. And now we're in a moment where that's the case even as wages in other lower paying jobs have actually gone up due to the sort of high demand and labor scarcity in the wake of the pandemic. But wages for childcare workers can't go up because families just can't afford to pay more without some kind of assistance.
Julie, like you said in the intro, your work focuses on what makes a job a good job. So what would make being a child care provider a good job? What do they need? What needs to change for them?
I think essentially child care providers need what we all need from a job. Enough money to support ourselves and our families, benefits to help us afford health insurance and a secure retirement, paid time off to care for ourselves when we get sick or for our kids, time to rest, and also sort of some sense of autonomy and that the work that you're doing matters in some way. What we hear from childcare providers is that they do often have a strong sense that their work matters. Like they're working with kids, they can watch them grow, they see every day how important this is, they know the families they care for depend on them. But that's about it. They don't really get anything else on the list. And that's so wrong. Yeah. I mean, this work is so important. And any person who is entrusting their child to a care provider knows it. But their compensation and their benefits and their time off and their time to care for themselves and their ability to support their own families, none of that is what they're getting because our system is too broken to allow it.
Again, it's a policy choice.
Yeah.
Well, and it's been interesting in thinking about all this, how much there are shades of conversations we have around education and teachers. Though I think the difference is, again, in that cultural depiction. If we were to make a list of media depictions of teachers, there's a million, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean they're paid well or enough, but at least that conversation is happening.
Mm-hmm.
With childcare providers, there's nothing, there's no Abbott Elementary for...
There should be.
Yes.
That's what we need.
Pitch. Yeah. Networks, come talk to us. We have some ideas.
And on the policy level, actually, one of the key things that we are fighting for is essentially just to bring compensation for childcare providers up to parity with kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers. We know that kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers are not paid enough, but they are paid far, far more than the people who are caring for younger kids.
So we have this broken system. But how do we, what do we want? What will fix it? If we were starting over, if we were going to give a new bill to President Biden instead of Nixon, right? What are we asking for, I think, both realistically now, and then what's the dream? How do we make the system work?
So what we're asking for right now as a baseline is to restore that emergency funding, that the pandemic levels of funding actually should be our starting point. But that is definitely not our end point. So $16 billion a year is the number we're asking for now. And that's what the Law Center and parents and workers and advocates all across the country are pushing for right now.
That's the plug in the hole funding.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I think the name of the bill is the Child Care Stabilization Act, because that is what it would do, is just stabilize where we are. But that's really just down payment on the universal child care that we should have had in place for half a century by now. And it's actually pretty easy to come up with the dollars that we need for that child care for all, if we just make sure billionaires and corporations are paying their fair share.
Hard. These are all just choices. Yeah. I think I wanted to ground the numbers here. The $16 billion, what would that mean for childcare providers and for families?
Again, that would be stabilizing the system. It would mean that states that had invested in paying childcare providers more, for example, would be able to keep up those pay increases. It's not necessarily enough to make every childcare job a good job, but it keeps us moving in the right direction instead of going backwards. And it prevents childcare centers from having to raise rates for families at minimum.
So it keeps it affordable, more people can access it, and it means that providers can stay in these jobs because they're getting paid enough to be able to work at all.
And support their own families.
Right, exactly. And that's what I mean. Yeah, exactly. And so universal childcare, it's a right. We should have it. Our whole country needs it. And even if you don't believe, even if you're Nixon, this is me. Sorry. Even if you're Richard Nixon, I'm just going to keep on picking on him here a little bit. It makes good business sense. If you want power and money, you still can't do that without childcare. Your workers can't work without childcare. You know, like our whole system requires it. So it's good. Like universal childcare would be like a good investment for the country.
It absolutely would. It doesn't work this way in other countries.
Right.
There are other models. We can choose a different path. We haven't yet, but we're working on it.
We need to move this whole childcare conversation into like an infrastructure conversation. Yeah. You cannot get to work, right? If you're going to work in person, you can't get there if there's no road.
Right.
You cannot go to work unless there's somebody there to care for your child, right? Like it's as simple as that. Right. It's infrastructure.
Well, and we know a lot of people make these decisions based on what happens with their families. But I think part of why we're talking about this and why we started this all, you know, in like looking at movies and TV is that until you go to look for childcare, you have no idea how bad the system is. You don't encounter it because it's also not depicted. And so I think that's another piece of this. Like we need movies and TV shows that actually show what it looks like to have childcare and recognize what's possible because of it.
100%. Honestly, I will confess, I thought maybe I was just totally blanking on all of these shows and movies that surely there was some depiction of it. So I was Googling, I was searching, and literally the only thing that came up was daddy daycare.
Yeah.
That was it.
Thank you both for coming and getting angry with me about the state of childcare in our country.
So glad that like this is reaching a larger audience because more people need to know about it. Just like you said, people don't have kids, people do have kids, people who are past the kid stage.
Right.
It's important.
It affects everybody.
It does.
Yep. Childcare is important for all of us. We can all have it. We just need more folks to join us.
A bigger village.
A government-sized village.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hillary.
Hearsay is a Wonder Media Network production in partnership with the National Women's Law Center. It is hosted and produced by Jessica Baskerville, Lark Lewis, and Hillary Woodward. Our producers are Adesua Agbenile, Grace Lynch, and Taylor Williamson. Jenny Kaplan is our executive producer, and Maddie Foley is our editor. Production assistance by Lucy Jones and show art by Andrea Sumner.
Mary Poppins.
Mm-hmm. You know, never watched the reboot.
We took our kids to that as like the first movie they were ever going to see in a theater.
Oh my God, yeah.
They made it about 6 minutes. And they were out. No offense, Emily Blunt.
We're done.